there's always been a burning question that I've always wondered seeing all this, because, this is what Greg would say, Greg Kokel. He's a good friend of both of ours. And if you were to carry this out to its logical conclusion, what is then the end game? I mean, if it's oppressed versus oppressor,
Oh.
and that is based on numbers, imagine for a second, if you will, if we flipped it then, is it ever possible that Black people could be oppressors of white people? Is that something in that worldview that would ever cross their mind? Like, imagine for a second if all of a sudden the population of Black Americans grew exponentially and surpassed those of white Americans. Well, then guess what? The white people are then a minority. Like, what is the end game? Like, what does this mean? What is their end game? When will it ever be enough for you guys to see, okay, now we can stop this whole oppression versus oppressor game? The truth is that it seems like it can never end, because somebody has to be in one of those categories based on this philosophy.
So playing something all the way out to its logical conclusion.
Yeah.
Um, gosh, I think that there are a number of ways to be able to look at that. Personally, and I'm not saying that, any critical theorist would say this, but personally, I believe that violence would be the logical conclusion, like playing things all the way out to their end. When will things be enough? I think that if we stay on this trajectory, violence, and I think we've already seen
Yeah.
violence,
Mm-hmm.
would be the logical conclusion. I think that looking at the idea of, when this goes all the way to the end, where will we be? I think the critical theorists would say that we will be at a place of equity. We'll be at a place of fairness.
Mm-hmm.
Unfortunately, to get to equity, it's kind of like Kendi says, in order to get rid of racism, and he doesn't, I'm not quoting him, but this is
Mm-hmm.
kind of just the gist of it. In order to get rid of racism, or to be able to get to like something that is more racially equitable, you might have to participate in racism, basically. So in order for us to bring Black people to a place of wealth equality with white people, we might have to participate with white people in a way that is despairing in regards to wealth, or that is not fair in regards to wealth. So it is okay when we look at the conversation of equity
Mm-hmm.
and the logical conclusion. Part of that logical conclusion would be that we would, in order to bring up a minority group, we would hold back another group for a
Yes.
period of time
Yeah.
in order to be able to make things equal or equitable for all parties involved.
Mm-hmm.
I think that is going to cause a lot of chaos and trouble, actually. The logical conclusion for, things in the, I would say, the more immediate future is like a unequal access to resources, or an unfair access to resources, so giving some students additional resources and withholding resources from other students. I
Yeah.
think it is watching our current culture uplift one group of people and yet actively
Yeah.
put down another group of people.
Yeah.
But in the end, I wonder if this will be something like I saw in South Africa, or in Zimbabwe, with land redistribution,
Mm.
um, wealth redistribution. That's something that's constantly on the table, constantly in conversation. How do we redistribute wealth? The goal is to transform a society, and we read that right out of this book. What does it look like to transform a society where those in power don't have that power, but everything is equal across the board, or equitable across the board?
Mm-hmm.
So we're gonna see, I suspect, more conversations of power dynamics and how do we shift the power from one group of people to another group of people, because this group of people has constantly been marginalized according to, the rhetoric.
Mm-hmm.
This group of people is constantly marginalized, has never had any power, has always been oppressed, And with that, I think we'll see things like I already have professors not receiving tenure at universities,
Mm-hmm.
white professors,
Mm-hmm.
all the way to, hiring and job promotions
Yeah.
and just what does this look like? I think Coke had it, the Coca-Cola Corporation, be less white.
Ugh.
They nailed it. They really nailed what I think the future really looks like of, what's the end game? Well, the end game is to be less white because white is oppressive. And when we get into like whiteness ideology and like whiteness theory and all of that, what whiteness means, people will be encouraged to be less white.
You mentioned like whiteness, be less white, all this. Can you please help me understand the mindset behind how they don't think that's racist? Because if I were to turn that around and be like, be less black,
Oh,
right?
girl, I can't. I cannot. Okay,
Please
here I
make that
am.
make sense. Because I do not get how that is not the most racist thing. And that's where the whole thing is that if you're told and taught, like, and it seems to be anyway, I mean, correct me if I'm wrong, that in this mind frame, you can't be racist if you're a person of color. You can't be. And then there's this weird I was talking to a friend about this. Her husband is Asian and like Chinese Asian. He works very hard, right? So they have this different work ethic, and it's almost like they're not as oppressed as black people. So it's like, yeah, you don't count. You're too white because you do white things. You follow more of the white mold when it comes to, logic or working hard. And I'm like, how are those things white? It is make this make sense for me, please.
Honey, there is only so much I can do. When we are talking about whiteness,
Mm-hmm.
most people are talking about a white Western European way of thinking, of doing things.
So like a cultural thing.
Yes,
So
being
whiteness
on
equates
time.
to that culture. Okay.
Yes.
All right.
So being on time. Now, I don't know, maybe in the history of Black people, ain't nobody ever aspired to be on time. I I don't think so, but that kind of is what it sounds like.
Yeah.
Being respectful, respecting authority. I don't know. I mean, I don't know if you saw the infographic from the Smithsonian, the African American Museum of
Oh,
like
I've seen a lot of things there.
art. Yeah.
Yeah.
Um, but they I think in 2020 released this whole whiteness pamphlet
Oh,
thing, brochure about like what whiteness is. And it talks about celebrating certain holidays, Judeo-Christian holidays, oddly enough,
yeah.
being on time, respecting authority, kindness, I think was on there, like doing logic, I was just like, what does this say about me? What do you think about me? Make it
Yeah.
make sense.
Yeah.
But so this whiteness isn't necessarily talking about skin color. Now, that being said, there is a tenet within the critical race theory realm
Mhm.
called whiteness as property. And it looks at how white people can use their white skin in a way that I can't use my black skin. And so when people say, well, I'm talking about whiteness as, the framework, or whiteness as the theory. I'm not talking about your white skin. This is why all white people can be racist, or why black people can participate in whiteness, because we're not looking at your skin color. I disagree.
So it's semantics to them.
It is. And a lot of this boils down to semantics, but I ardently disagree,
That is garbage.
because it does. It comes down oftentimes to skin color because of whiteness as property.
Yeah.
And
Well, let's
so
pretend for a second that I'm using blackness in the same way. Like, oh, I don't mean
you
it
would
by the
be a
color of
racist.
your skin. I'm meaning it
Mm-hmm.
by blackness as a culture. That would be just as racist. So
Yes.
I don't know how that follows.
No,
That
and no one wants to talk about the racism being spewed toward white people that would never fly if it was
ever,
coming the other way.
ever.
And so I'm gonna take this into something called microaggressions.
I wanted to ask you
Micro
about that. Yeah.
Yes.
Yeah, go
So
ahead.
microaggressions being the normal, everyday, like just run of the mill, innocent, slight, like acts of racism.
Okay.
So it would be things like insults or harsh comments, things that I, as the person of color, understand to be racist because I understand racism, because I'm a person of color. So it comes down to this special knowledge that I have as being a person of color that a white person would not have. A microaggression is not something that a person of color can do to a white person.
Oh,
Microaggressions, and I really want to just read like the definition of microaggressions. I had it here earlier. Oh, here it is. Let me see. It's the everyday verbal, nonverbal, and environmental slights, snubs, or insults, whether intentional or unintentional, which communicate hostile, derogatory, or negative messages to target persons based solely upon their marginalized group membership. So, what is this telling us? First off the bat, it's telling me that a white person can never experience a microaggression because it only is based solely upon the marginalized group membership. It's the environmental slights, snubs, or insults. Okay, that slight means that it's very subtle,
okay.
whether intentional or unintentional. So racism now happens intentionally or unintentionally. It happens whether you know you're doing it or whether you don't know you're doing it.
What a terrible burden.
Yes,
This is a critical theory thing, right? Not just a critical race theory,
this
right?
is it, this started out as a critical race theory
Okay.
conversation of microaggressions, but now what you see, because critical race theory, think of, okay,
Mm-hmm.
pause, think of critical theory as a train
Okay.
with many different cars. Critical theory is the driving engine. Okay,
Okay.
so all the other cars are propelled and move forward by critical theory. Well, what's the first car we see after the critical theory engine? Well, we see critical legal studies.
Uh-huh.
Some would say disability theory, but I'm looking like critical legal studies.
Mm-hmm.
Right after critical legal studies in the 70s, what do we see? We see critical race theory in the late 80s.
Mm-hmm.
Right after critical race theory, what do we see but LGBTQ plus theory
Mm-hmm.
I think it's LGBTQ plus or feminist theory. It's somewhere
Okay.
along that.
Yeah.
Just stick with the train. Somewhere in the like early 90s, but you also get critical queer theory, you
Yes.
get child studies,
Mm-hmm.
fat studies, ableist theory. These are all cars on this very long train. And so when you hear a term like microaggressions or inclusivity, what you have to think is, how is this connected to the larger group? Case in point, in 2020, we heard a lot of language about being inclusive
Mm-hmm.
racially. How am I being an inclusive stand? How are we standing for inclusivity in my workplace? Making sure that we have representation.
Mm-hmm.
Cool. Nobody wants to leave people out. Like we just don't want to leave you out because, you bear brown skin. I don't think
Yeah.
that's cool. But here's the conversation. Here's the question. What does it mean when you adopt this narrative and this wording?
Mm-hmm.
What does it mean in the broader spectrum of ideas? Well,
Mm-hmm.
it also means that, well, I'm inclusive. So now I'm including my Black, brown, BIPOC people.
Mm-hmm.
Great. And I also have to include my LGBTQ plus people. I also have to include the what do you call it? Religiously marginalized.
Yeah.
So, what does this mean for your pulpit? What does this mean for your church as you have your Black Lives Matter flag, just blowing in the wind because we're an inclusive community? Well, that means that when the two-spirit person who identifies, on the queer spectrum comes
Mm-hmm.
to your church and says, well, I want to also be a pastor
Uh-huh.
because y'all inclusive, aren't you? Or
Yes.
is it a lie? Or when the Muslim person or the religiously marginalized person, whatever their religious affiliation, comes and says, well, I want to be baptized in your church too,
Uh-huh.
or I want to participate, or whatever. however that looks for them, how can we say no?